Distinctively black names are not a modern invention. They did not suddenly appear during the civil rights era, nor were they born out of recent cultural trends. In fact, the story of black-sounding names begins much earlier, woven into the very foundations of American history itself. For generations, names like Jemal, Latasha, or Laquisha have been treated as symbols of something new, often misunderstood, mocked, or reduced to stereotypes. But history tells a very different story. Long before these names existed, Black Americans were already developing unique naming traditions shaped by faith, survival, resistance, and the search for identity in a society that repeatedly tried to erase it. From the days of enslavement, when African names were stripped away and replaced, to the quiet persistence of biblical, symbolic, and culturally meaningful names, Black naming practices became a subtle but powerful form of self-definition. These names carried memory when written records were denied. They carried dignity when freedom was delayed. And they carried identity when everything else was taken. What is even more surprising is that historical records, census data, ship manifests, and early birth registries reveal a consistent pattern. Distinctly black names existed in every era of American history. Not just during moments of political awakening. The names changed, but the tradition endured. This story is not just about names. It is about culture. It is about how people assert humanity under pressure, how identity survives oppression, and how something as simple as a name can hold generations of meaning. So as we begin this journey into the surprising history of black-sounding names, I invite you to listen closely, not just to the facts, but to what they reveal about resilience and self-expression. If you find this story insightful, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join the conversation. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories history often overlooks. If the opening of this story reveals that distinctively black names are far older than most people assume, the evidence that follows gives that truth weight, texture, and continuity, as historians move beyond assumptions and began examining newly digitized census records, birth registries, ship manifests, and slave-era documents. A quiet pattern emerged, one that reshapes how we understand identity across centuries. Again and again, the data pointed to the same conclusion. Roughly 3% of black Americans carried names that were uniquely theirs. Names rarely or never used by white Americans. And this proportion remained remarkably stable from the 19th century into the 20th. At first glance, 3% may sound small, but in historical terms, it is anything but insignificant. Across generations marked by forced migration, enslavement, legal exclusion, and cultural erasure, this consistency tells a powerful story. It suggests that even when lives were controlled and choices were limited, naming remained one of the few spaces where identity could quietly endure. The specific names changed over time, shaped by religion, politics, language, and geography, but the tradition itself did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, bending with history rather than breaking beneath it. In the early 19th century, many of these distinct names carried biblical weight or symbolic strength, reflecting both spiritual faith and aspirations for freedom. As decades passed, new influences entered black communities, including European languages, regional dialects, and later, the cultural shifts of the post-emancipation period. Yet despite these changes, the boundary between black and white naming patterns remained visible in the records. What stands out is not the sameness of the names themselves, but the persistence of difference, a deliberate cultural signature that survived even when other forms of self-expression were denied. Slave-era records deepen this understanding in unexpected ways. Because official census documents rarely recorded the names of enslaved individuals, researchers turned to alternative sources. ship logs, estate inventories, runaway advertisements, and plantation records. Within these fragmented archives, distinct names appear again and again, sometimes alongside nicknames or alternate identities used within families and communities. These layered naming practices reveal a world where a single individual might be known by different names depending on context, a reflection of both constraint and resilience. Even under surveillance and control, naming remained fluid, personal, and meaningful. What is perhaps most striking is that while the share of Black Americans with distinct names held steady, the use of those same names among white Americans declined sharply over time. Names that once crossed racial lines gradually became markers of difference, as white society distanced itself culturally while Black communities continued to carry and transform them. By the late 19th century, this separation was no longer accidental. It was embedded in social structure and reinforced by custom. Names became quiet indicators of belonging, history, and collective memory. Moving into the 20th century, the continuity becomes even clearer. Although new naming styles emerged, influenced by migration, urbanization, and global culture, the underlying pattern remained intact. 3% endured as a constant thread, linking generations who never met yet shared an inherited approach to identity. This is not a story of trend or coincidence, but of cultural persistence across time. When viewed in this light, Black naming traditions are no longer a footnote or curiosity. They are evidence of how identity survives across centuries, carried not through monuments or official recognition, but through something as intimate and enduring as a name. As the historical record continues to unfold, the evolution of Black naming practices begins to read less like a sequence of trends and more like a living narrative shaped by faith, struggle, and changing visions of freedom. In the earliest generations documented in American records, many distinctively Black names carried deep biblical meaning or spoke directly to ideas of authority, dignity, and liberation. Names such as Moses, Isaiah, Abraham, Prince, King, and Freeman were not chosen at random. They reflected a worldview in which names served as declarations, quiet but powerful statements about identity in a society that denied both voice and autonomy. Biblical names held particular resonance. Stories of exile, captivity, deliverance, and divine justice mirrored the lived experiences of Black communities, especially during and after enslavement. Moses, the leader who guided his people out of bondage, became more than a religious figure. His name functioned as a symbol of hope and moral clarity. Isaiah and Abraham carried connotations of covenant, endurance, and destiny. These names allowed families to embed meaning into the lives of their children, often in ways that were invisible to those outside the community but deeply understood within it. Alongside religious influence, symbolic names such as Prince, King, and Freeman expressed aspirations that went beyond the conditions of the present. In eras when freedom was restricted or newly gained, these names projected a future that had not yet fully arrived. They were acts of imagination as much as identity, affirming worth in a world that systematically denied it. Even when these names stood in stark contrast to lived reality, they asserted a sense of personhood that could not be legislated away. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, these naming traditions did not vanish. They transformed. Social change, migration, and exposure to new cultural influences introduced fresh sounds, languages, and styles. Yet the underlying purpose of naming remained the same. Names continued to reflect collective experience, evolving alongside shifting political realities. During periods of intensified struggle and activism, especially in the mid-20th century, Black naming practices began to reflect broader social and political movements that emphasized pride, autonomy, and cultural self-definition. New names emerged that sounded different from earlier biblical or symbolic choices, but they served a similar function. They marked a conscious distance from assimilation and an embrace of distinct identity. These names reflected an era in which public resistance became more visible, and self-expression took on renewed urgency. Where earlier generations encoded meaning through scripture and symbolism, later generations drew from global cultures, historical figures, and creative linguistic forms to articulate belonging and resistance in a changing world. What ties these eras together is not the surface form of the names themselves, but the continuity of intention. Across generations, Black families used naming as a way to speak when other forms of speech were limited, to remember when official history excluded them, and to claim dignity in the face of shifting social boundaries. Each generation inherited not a fixed list of names, but a tradition of meaning-making that adapted to new circumstances while remaining rooted in shared experience. Seen in this way, the evolution of Black names is not a departure from the past, but an extension of it. Biblical names of deliverance and symbolic names of power laid the groundwork for later expressions shaped by political awareness and cultural change. Together, they form a continuous thread, one that reveals how identity is carried forward, not through sameness, but through purposeful transformation across time. To fully understand how Black naming traditions evolved, the story must return to the period that reshaped identity more violently than any other. Enslavement. Long before biblical or symbolic names appeared in American records, Africans arrived with names rooted in language, religion, lineage, and geography. These names carried histories older than the nations that would later record them. Yet upon arrival, one of the first acts of control imposed upon enslaved people was the removal of those names, an attempt to sever memory from identity and replace it with something more manageable within a system built on domination. European and classical names were often imposed in their place, drawn from Roman mythology, literature, or Christian tradition. Names like Titus, Hercules, Venus, or Hannibal appeared repeatedly in plantation records and slave-era documents. To the outside world, these names may have suggested civilization or order, but within the lived experience of enslavement, they reflected power imbalance and ownership. A name became a label assigned rather than a choice made, a marker of who controlled the right to define another human being. Yet even in this imposed system, naming never became a one-way process. Beneath the surface of official records, African traditions persisted. Within families and communities, enslaved people continued to use names drawn from their own languages or adapted versions of them, often alongside the names recorded by enslavers. These informal names, sometimes referred to in historical sources as country names or nicknames, functioned as quiet acts of cultural continuity. They allowed individuals to be known as more than what the system declared them to be, preserving identity in spaces that existed beyond official recognition. Evidence of this dual naming practice appears in runaway notices, personal accounts, and regional records, where individuals are described with more than one name, each reflecting a different social reality. One name belonged to the world of surveillance and control. The other belonged to kinship, memory, and belonging. This layered identity reveals how naming operated not merely as administration, but as a site of negotiation between oppression and resistance. Over time, religious movements such as the Great Awakening introduced new naming influences. Christian names began to spread more widely among enslaved populations, not always by force, but sometimes by choice. Biblical narratives offered language for suffering, endurance, and eventual deliverance, and names associated with those stories became tools for meaning-making. Even so, the adoption of these names did not erase African influence. Rather, it blended with it, creating a distinct cultural expression shaped by both survival and adaptation. What is striking is that, Despite the violence of forced renaming, enslaved communities retained agency in how names were lived, spoken, and remembered. Naming children, sharing nicknames, and passing down alternative identities became ways of asserting humanity when legal recognition was denied. These practices laid the groundwork for the continuity seen in later generations, where naming remained one of the few traditions that could be carried forward intact. When viewed alongside the earlier persistence of distinctively black names and the later emergence of symbolic and political naming styles, the role of enslavement becomes clear. It was not a period that erased identity, but one that reshaped how identity was protected and expressed. Names became vessels of memory, holding fragments of African heritage, collective experience, and quiet defense. In this way, the legacy of enslavement is inseparable from the resilience embedded in black naming traditions, linking past and present through acts of remembrance that survived even the most severe attempts at erasure. With emancipation came a profound and unfamiliar freedom, the ability to choose one's own name, after generations in which names had been assigned, altered, or erased. Many Black Americans approached naming not as a formality, but as an act of self-definition. This moment did not erase the past. Instead, it marked a turning point where identity could be publicly claimed rather than privately protected. The choice to change a name, keep an imposed one, or redefine it entirely became deeply personal, shaped by memory, survival, and the desire to step into a future no longer legally denied. For some, reclaiming autonomy meant shedding surnames tied to enslavement and ownership. Others kept those names, transforming them through new meaning rather than rejection, using continuity as a way to anchor family lineage in a society that had long disrupted it. Still others chose entirely new names that reflected aspiration, faith, or moral clarity. These decisions were rarely simple. They carried the weight of history, family ties, and the tension between remembering and moving forward. What united them was intention. Naming was no longer something done to Black Americans. It became something done by them. As communities rebuilt after emancipation, names began to reflect newly claimed citizenship and belonging. Children were named after national figures, biblical leaders, or admired thinkers, signaling both participation in American life and a redefinition of what that participation meant. In households where generations had been denied legal recognition, naming children after fathers or grandparents became an assertion of continuity and legitimacy. Through these choices, names functioned as bridges between past and future, linking inherited struggle with newly imagined possibility. This pattern of intentional naming did not fade with time. Instead, it resurfaced with renewed intensity during the civil rights and Black Power movements of the 20th century. As public resistance became more visible, naming once again became a site of declaration. Prominent figures adopted new names to mark ideological transformation, spiritual alignment, or political awakening. These changes were not cosmetic. They signaled a refusal to be defined by histories imposed without consent and a determination to articulate identity on one's own terms. What distinguished this era was the visibility of these choices. When activists, athletes, and intellectuals renamed themselves, they carried a tradition that had long existed quietly within families into the national spotlight. The public debate that followed revealed how deeply names are tied to power, recognition, and legitimacy. Resistance to these changes often mirrored resistance to the broader movements themselves, underscoring that naming was never merely personal. It was cultural and political. Yet even as these highly visible examples drew attention, countless ordinary name changes unfolded away from public view. Families chose names that reflected heritage, spirituality, or creative expression, continuing a lineage of adaptation that stretched back through enslavement and Reconstruction. the specific sounds and structures of names evolved, influenced by global culture and shifting social realities, but the underlying impulse remained consistent. Naming was still a way to assert presence in a society that had long questioned it. When viewed in continuity with earlier periods, this era of renaming does not appear as a rupture, but as a reaffirmation. The same instinct that preserved African names in private spaces during enslavement, that infused biblical and symbolic meaning into 19th century naming, now found expression through conscious reinvention. Emancipation made choice possible, and later movements made that choice visible, but the foundation had been laid generations earlier. In this way, the story of post-emancipation name changes is not simply about rejection of the past. It is about transformation, continuity, and authorship. Names became statements of belonging defined from within, carrying forward a tradition in which identity is not inherited passively, but actively shaped across time. Today, Black names continue to carry deep cultural meaning, serving as living symbols of history, creativity, and identity. They are the result of centuries of adaptation shaped by faith, survival, resistance, and self-definition, and they remain one of the most personal ways people express who they are and where they come from. Yet even as society has changed, the social weight attached to these names has not disappeared. Instead, it has taken on new forms, revealing how the past still echoes in the present. Modern research makes this reality difficult to ignore. Studies examining hiring practices consistently show that names perceived as Black are less likely to receive callbacks for job opportunities than names perceived as white, even when qualifications are identical. This does not mean that a name determines a person's future, but it does show how assumptions attached to names can quietly influence decisions in spaces meant to be fair and neutral. In these moments, a name becomes more than an identifier. It becomes a signal through which bias, often unconscious, can shape outcomes. What makes this especially striking is that these same names are often chosen with care, intention, and pride. They reflect family history, cultural continuity, and creative expression. For many parents, naming a child is an act of hope, a way to pass on meaning and belonging in a world that does not always offer equal footing. The tension between this intention and the reality of discrimination highlights a broader truth. Names do not create inequality, but they can expose it. At the same time, acceptance is growing. Black names are increasingly visible in media, professional spaces, and public life, carried by individuals who redefine expectations simply by being present and successful. As these names become more familiar, they challenge long-standing stereotypes and expand ideas of professionalism and legitimacy. Each time a name once considered different is spoken with respect, the cultural landscape shifts, even if only slightly. Seen in full, the history of Black naming is not a story of limitation, but of endurance. From African origins to enslavement, from emancipation to modern movements for justice and recognition, names have carried memory forward when written records failed and voices were ignored. They have adapted to new eras while remaining rooted in the same core impulse, the desire to be seen, known, and valued on one's own terms. Understanding this history invites a deeper reflection on how society assigns meaning, how bias operates beneath the surface, and how something as simple as a name can hold centuries of experience. It reminds us that progress is not only measured by laws or policies, but by everyday recognition by whose names are respected, remembered, and given equal opportunity to be heard. Thank you for taking the time to explore this journey through history, identity, and meaning. If this story added perspective or challenged the way you think about names and culture, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive, and we look forward to continuing this exploration with you in the next story.